I think this slide pretty much sums up South Africa's dilemma. In 1997, London News won the QE2 Cup, becoming the first South African-bred racehorse to win a group race in Hong Kong. And on Sunday, as we all know, 17 years later, Variety Club won the coveted Champions Mile, becoming the first foreign horse to break the local stranglehold on this famous race. Both horses were South African-bred champions, but that's where the similarities end. London News was shipped directly from Cape Town in 1997 following a 40-day pre-export quarantine, whilst Variety Club's journey took 4 times as long, via 3 different countries. The fact that he arrived in Hong Kong and Dubai before that in one piece is remarkable in itself. London News left Cape Town match fit and ready to race, whilst Variety Club was out of work for 110 days before arriving in the UK to take up his program of getting back to fitness again. And the question that must be asked is, how is it possible that South African exporters face greater constraints today than they did 17 years ago when the protocol was first ratified by the EU and other trading partners? And at this juncture, whilst Joe has referred to it, I think the role that Racing South Africa plays in the process of exporting needs to be clarified. Firstly, we're a non-profit organisation funded by the major stakeholders of racing. And secondly, our functions that we provide are to fund equine research-related activities, to market our bloodstock abroad, and to manage Kenilworth Quarantine Station in Cape Town under the authority of the State Veterinary Services. And this is not intended to be a veterinary or scientific dissertation, but it is not possible to answer the topic without referring to the disease which so heavily constrains us, and that's African horse sickness. No one denies that African horse sickness is a dangerous disease, but equally, South Africa's quarantine has proven to be entirely safe. There are 4 dates of relevance, and I think for the purposes of this discussion. Pre-1950s, by the end of the World War II, South Africa had exported over 300,000 horses by sea in support of the war effort, with no case of African horse sickness ever having been attributed to those shipments. 1958, the outbreak of African horse sickness in the Middle East, which effectively declared or led to the declaration that Africa was infected with this disease. That was a decision taken by the OIE, and they suspended all imports of horses from from Africa henceforth. The exception being the USA, which developed a post-arrival quarantine in New York because there was demand for Arabian horses. And that lockdown, the 60-day lockdown in New York, continues to be a viable alternative for South Africa to this very day. The 1992 Barcelona Olympic Games was affected by an outbreak of African horse sickness in Spain in the late 1980s. And they developed through the OIE the concept of regionalization or zoning, as you heard beforehand. And then moving forward to 1997, this was the date when South Africa ratified the protocol with the European Union. It was based on regionalization, and part of South Africa, the Western Cape, was declared to be free of the disease, predominantly on the basis that it was historically free, and secondly, that it was a significant distance, over 1,600 kilometers away from the most endemic areas to the north and east of the country. And of course, it had geographic boundaries, the Atlantic Ocean on the west and the Indian Ocean on the east, and a substantial mountain range which separated the rest of the country from the Western Cape. And whilst acknowledging certain weaknesses in the systems, the last 17 years have seen 1,500 exports from Kenilworth Quarantine Station. Improved science, in particular diagnostic testing, improved reporting, improved management of outbreaks, and improved management of arguably the most sophisticated vector-protected pre-export quarantine in the world. And this was certainly highlighted by the European Union's veterinary inspection in May of last year. However, on the other hand, following 6 outbreaks of African horse sickness in the AHS controlled area, if I just move the slide, just to give you an indication of the zone, which is in the Cape, following 6 outbreaks of African horse sickness since 1997 in the controlled area. The consequence, the record shows that South Africa has in fact spent 50% of the time under suspension. the consequence of detecting virus in the zone being a temporary but mandatory 24-month suspension of exporting according to EU legislation. The record shows that South Africa has in fact spent 50% of the time under suspension. The consequence of detecting virus in the zone being a temporary but mandatory 24-month suspension of exporting according to EU legislation. And herein lies the crux of the matter. In Southern Africa, AHS is an historically seasonal disease, and by that I mean that it does not occur during our winter months. And whilst there are natural fluctuations in climatic conditions, there has always been an annual window where the disease simply disappears. The lengthy shutdown is our number one problem and has resulted in massive erosion of our market share and hardly believable, hugely expensive, and very risky alternatives delivery routes that our horses and horsemen have had to endure. By reducing the period of suspension following an outbreak in the controlled area, exporting from South Africa becomes viable, even if for a limited number of shipments per annum. And it is hoped that a recent proposed changes to the existing system will encourage importing countries to consider allowing annual shipments to take place from the Cape, irrespective of whether there's been an outbreak in the year of that. But more on that later. And I think it's now necessary just to briefly have a look at the South African horse racing industry. After all, this is a racing convention. Like many other jurisdictions in the world, racing was introduced by the British colonial masters of the time, and racing first took place in the Cape and Greenpoint Common 200 years ago. Racing thrived, as did the gaming industry, and up until 1994, when the first democratically elected government took over, racing, in fact, was a monopoly, holding 100% of market share. But the new government introduced an aggressive policy of liberalizing the gaming sector, and our market share is today 7%. And whilst acknowledging that the gaming sector has certainly grown, racing's share of the pie is simply not big enough to support growth in the industry. And rationalization has become an indelible part of racing's survival. And indeed, today, 9 racetracks remain from the 14 that were in existence but 15, 20 years ago. I think it's necessary to show that on the breeding side as well, there have been significant declines. Between 1986 and 2010, the number of registered breeders were down from 1,100 to 350. The number of stallions down from 310 to 105. And the number of broodmares cut by half from 7,000, which was recorded in 1986. And in a country whose unemployment officially sits at 25%, unofficial figures suggest, in fact, that it's closer to 40%. One of the most sinister consequences of a contracting racing and breeding industry is unemployment. And whereas in 1995, when a study was performed by the Western Cape government, 100,000 people had found employment in the South African horse racing industry. An economic impact study commissioned by Racing South Africa in 2009 showed that employment had dropped to just 16,000. If you look on the other side of the coin, perhaps racehorse owners are bearing possibly the greatest brunt of the decline in prize money returns, and certainly have very little hope of a return on investment. And whilst South Africa, as a racing jurisdiction, is in the top 10 in terms of number of races and runners, of runners and races run, South Africa ranks only 19th in average earnings per runner. And compared with Hong Kong, which sits at the top of the pile, South Africans' average earnings per runner is nearly 20 times lower, thus making our horses, eligible horses for entry to Hong Kong, very desirable and certainly affordable considering the low cost of production. I think it is very clear that South Africa, it's a well-known fact that we offer a great degree of value to importing countries and buyers in particular. If you look at a comparative slide comparing all the international sales prices across the major racing jurisdictions, South Africa trades at about 20% of the global average. And of course, on the quality side, we know that South Africa is capable of producing champions. And if you look at the horses that are highlighted there, of course, Variety Club having won in Dubai as well as in Hong Kong. JJ the Jet Planer, another remarkable story coming through the tortuous program of exporting out of Cape Town, and Iridescence before him, but those are just a number of many top horses that have graced the world tracks. If you look at that in relative to the number of horses that we have residing in the world's racing tracks, today we estimate that there are only 40 horses that are currently racing outside of South Africa. And that's ignoring the island of Mauritius, which imports 125 horses per annum. However, on the upside, there is a significant opportunity to develop our export industry, which we estimate currently at $25 million US dollars per annum, which with reliable and regular export delivery, if that can be solved, this could be increased very quickly to $100 million US dollars per annum. We recently held an export workshop, and this was a gathering of international experts in the field of veterinary science and regulatory frameworks. This is local government, Department of Agriculture and Veterinary Services, and of course the sport horse and racing sectors. And we believe that there is a potential solution to the existing problem, and whilst concentrating on 4 strategies, which include an alternative AHS free zone somewhere else in the country, of course continuing to use USA when logistics and economics allow, and of course the back door at the moment is Mauritius, despite its lengthy journey time. But really our focus and our primary focus is to upgrade Kenilworth Quarantine Station, already a vector protected facility, but by housing the exercise requirements under one roof, we can provide continuous vector protection for the duration of the quarantine. And if you take a view that we're already having intensive surveillance and movement controls into the controlled area, this is about the best of both worlds. And I think South Africa is really appealing to its importing countries and fellow racing jurisdictions to persuade the governments to relook at South Africa's import conditions, and that possibly this conversion of Kenilworth might be the solution that they're all looking for. We're looking for reliability, and I think if we can achieve reliability, there are enormous upsides, not only for South Africa, but also being able to participate and contribute to the global development of horse racing. And certainly we'll see growth in exports. My estimation that it's worth $4 billion US dollars per annum. We have to improve our blood lines, and through shuttle stallions, I think that's seen the complete metamorphosis of the Australian and New Zealand and South American markets. And of course, we would like to easily compete in the bubble concept that's been so eloquently described beforehand. South Africa needs to be part of that system. And of course, one of our ambitions, not only the Olympic Games, but is the ability to host international equestrian competition in South Africa. We believe that we have a slot in our calendar which fits very kindly with the rest of the world. And so, ladies and gentlemen, we believe that Racing South Africa, or South Africa, has a serious role to play, and we take our role in the International Federation as well as the Asian racing community very seriously. And I thank you for your time.